At 0400 hours on the 11th of November, 2022, the black asphalt of the Antonivsky Bridge was not a road, but a graveyard of engineering. 6 months of precision-guided munitions had turned the 1,000-meter concrete span into a colander of jagged rebar and scorched craters. For the 20,000 Russian paratroopers stationed on the western bank of the Dnipro River, this bridge was their only umbilical cord to survival, and it had just been severed. The High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, had spent 90 days methodically punching holes through the same coordinates with the repetitive mechanical cruelty of a hole puncher. It was a tactical strangulation. By the time the Russian High Command realized their elite airborne units were trapped in the only regional capital they had managed to seize, the math of logistics had already dictated the surrender. They weren't being outfought in a trench. They were being starved by the geometry of a river. This is the story of how a billion-dollar army was defeated by a collapsing bridge and a fruit that became a symbol of defiance. Before we continue, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. The problem for the Russian occupation was as old as warfare itself. You cannot hold ground, you cannot feed. To sustain 20,000 soldiers, an army requires hundreds of tons of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies every single day. When the Ukrainian military began utilizing the M142 HIMARS, they didn't aim for the soldiers, they aimed for the infrastructure. Each M31 rocket carries a 200-pound high-explosive fragmentation warhead guided by GPS to within 5 meters of its target. Think of it as a sniper rifle with a 5-mile reach and the power to level a warehouse. By August, every fixed bridge over the Dnipro was impassable for heavy trucks. The Russians attempted to solve this with a fleet of pontoon ferries, essentially giant floating Lego bricks lashed together with outboard motors. It was a desperate solution that worked for exactly 48 hours. Ukrainian drones hovering 2,000 feet above the gray water watched the ferries dock and relayed the coordinates. Within minutes, the riverbank would erupt in a synchronized series of explosions, leaving the paratroopers on the far side with nothing but the bullets already in their pockets. By late October, the atmospheric pressure inside Kherson city had reached a breaking point. The elite Russian 4th Division paratroopers, known for their aggressive doctrine, found themselves reduced to scavenging for civilian vehicles to move supplies. Every time they tried to repair the Antonivsky Bridge, a fresh volley of 6 rockets would arrive at Mach 2.5 to undo days of labor. The technical reality was brutal. The Russians were trying to defend a city with their backs to a massive water barrier while their enemy held the high ground and the long-range sensors. Intelligence reports began to surface of Russian officers swapping their uniforms for civilian clothes, hoping to blend into the local population if the front collapsed. The tactical win for Ukraine was invisible, but absolute. They had created a pocket where the cost of staying was higher than the cost of retreating. The threat of a total massacre of 20,000 men loomed, forcing the Russian Minister of Defense to appear on state television and announce a withdrawal that would become the most significant humiliation of the entire campaign. The retreat itself was a masterpiece of organized chaos and high-stakes gambling. Thousands of Russian vehicles began a frantic crawl toward the river. To prevent the Ukrainians from spotting the movement, the Russians deployed radar reflectors, simple metallic pyramids designed to confuse the seekers of incoming missiles by creating ghost targets on radar screens. It was a low-tech shield against high-tech swords. However, the Ukrainian General Staff had anticipated this. They shifted their focus from the bridges to the choke points leading to the ferry crossings. As the Russian columns bunched up at the water's edge, the night sky over Kherson was illuminated by the constant arc of outgoing artillery. The sound was a rhythmic hammering that echoed off the Soviet-era apartment blocks. For the Russian soldiers, every second spent waiting for a ferry was a second they were vulnerable to a 2,000-pound cluster of tungsten fragments. By dawn, the last of the operational equipment had been ferried across, leaving behind hundreds of abandoned trucks and a city that held its breath. As the sun rose on the 11th of November, the silence in the center of Kherson was more terrifying than the shelling. For 8 months, the city had lived under the shadow of the Russian secret police, the FSB, and the constant hum of Tiger armored vehicles. Now, there were no patrols. The Russian flags that had flown over the regional administration buildings were gone, replaced by empty flagpoles. In the suburb of Bilozerka, a small group of locals emerged from their cellars, eyes squinting against the light. They didn't see tanks. They saw a lone Ukrainian scout on a dusty motorcycle, and blue and yellow ribbon fluttering from his antenna. The first fast win of the morning occurred when a grandmother approached the soldier, not with a weapon, but with a jar of pickles and a map of where the Russians had buried their mines. It was the spark that lit the fuse. Within 2 hours, the trickle of civilians turned into a flood, and the world was about to witness a viral phenomenon that no military strategist could have predicted. The transition from occupation to liberation was not a slow transition, but a total atmospheric shift that occurred in under 60 minutes. As the first Ukrainian reconnaissance teams entered the city center, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of abandoned Russian checkpoints and discarded uniforms. The tactical threat had shifted from heavy artillery to the invisible danger of booby traps. Russian engineers had spent the previous 72 hours rigging doorways, discarded ammunition crates, and even civilian washing machines with tripwires and anti-personnel mines. A single tripwire, thinner than a human hair, connected to an OZ M72 jumping mine, can clear a radius of 25 meters in a fraction of a second. This was the final spite of a retreating army. However, the Ukrainian sappers, moving with the cold efficiency of men who had seen this before, used thermal optics to detect the heat signatures of disturbed earth and electronic jammers to neutralize remote detonated explosives. The risk was extreme, but the payoff was immediate. By 10:30 in the morning, the main square was declared clear enough for the public, and the city exploded in a roar that could be heard across the river. The psychological weight of the moment was represented by a simple, everyday object: the watermelon. For decades, the Kherson region had been the agricultural heart of the country, responsible for over 50% of its summer fruit production. During the 8 months of occupation, the watermelon had transformed from a snack into a symbol of resistance. As Ukrainian soldiers rolled into the Freedom Square on the back of mud-cattered Kozak II armored vehicles, they weren't met with requests for bread or water, but with giant, green-striped fruits that locals had hidden in their basements for this exact day. It was a visual victory that bypassed language. On the digital front, videos of these encounters began to saturate global social media feeds at a rate of 10,000 views per minute. The technical impact was profound. While the Russian propaganda machine was trying to frame the retreat as a strategic repositioning to the eastern bank, the raw, unedited footage of soldiers being kissed by grandmothers and handed watermelons told a different story. The narrative war was won before the Russian paratroopers had even finished digging their new trenches on the opposite side of the Dnipro. While the celebration consumed the streets, the military reality remained a high-wire act of surveillance and counter-battery fire. The Dnipro River is not just a body of water. It is a geographic moat that varies in width from 500 to over 1,000 meters. On the eastern bank, the Russians had spent weeks constructing the Surovikin line, a dense network of dragon's teeth, anti-tank ditches, and fortified bunkers. From these heights, Russian observers used Orlan-10 drones to spot any Ukrainian movement in the newly liberated city. The problem for the Ukrainian forces was that they were now standing in a bowl, visible to every Russian gunner with a line of sight across the water. The solution was the rapid deployment of the PWM, a counter-battery radar system. This system acts like a digital ear, listening for the sonic boom of an outgoing shell and calculating the trajectory back to the source in less than 5 seconds. Every time a Russian mortar team attempted to harass the crowds in the square, a Ukrainian M777 howitzer would return fire with laser-guided precision before the first Russian shell had even impacted. It was a deadly game of whack-a-mole that ensured the liberation stayed a celebration and not a massacre. The most shocking discovery of the day was found not in the military barracks, but beneath the floorboards of ordinary homes. For 256 days, the residents of Kherson had lived under a regime that criminalized their identity. To be caught with a Ukrainian flag was a sentence to a basement interrogation center. Yet, as the soldiers moved through the neighborhoods, they watched as people used shovels and crowbars to dig up plastic-wrapped bundles from their gardens. Inside were pristine blue and yellow flags that had been buried since March. The technical risk these civilians took was immense. The Russian security forces used signal intelligence and frequent house-to-house searches to find such symbols. The fact that thousands of flags appeared within hours of the retreat was a systemic failure of the Russian intelligence apparatus. They had occupied the land, but they had never occupied the people. This organic uprising provided the Ukrainian military with something more valuable than ground. It provided a map of every collaborator and every hidden Russian stay-behind agent who had been left to conduct sabotage. By mid-afternoon, the local resistance had handed over a list of coordinates that neutralized the remaining threats before they could strike. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the focus shifted to the massive logistical challenge of restoring a city that had been stripped of its soul. The retreating Russians had destroyed the power grid, the water pumping stations, and the cellular towers. Kherson was a dark city. To solve this, the Ukrainian government deployed the first wave of Starlink terminals and mobile power stations. This was a technological bridge that reconnected 60,000 people to the outside world in a single afternoon. Men and women huddled around small white satellite dishes, their faces illuminated by the glow of smartphones as they made the first phone calls to their families in nearly a year. The fast win here was the collapse of the information blackout. Within minutes, the reality of life under occupation began to pour out in a torrent of voice notes and photos. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a data-driven reclamation of history. The high-resolution sensors of the Western satellites, which had tracked the Russian retreat. The final phase of the liberation was a race against the cold and the residual shadow of the Russian artillery positioned just 600 meters across the water. While the crowds in the square were still singing, the Ukrainian military was facing a tactical nightmare. A major city with zero running water, no electricity, and a heating system that had been systematically sabotaged by retreating engineers. The Russians had not just left, they had attempted to delete the city's ability to sustain human life. To counter this, the Ukrainian government initiated a logistical surge that mirrored a combat operation. Over 200 Starlink terminals were distributed to key hospitals and administrative buildings, creating a high-speed data canopy over a city that had been digitally blind for 8 months. This allowed engineers to use remote diagnostics to map the damage to the power grid, identifying the specific transformers that had been rigged with explosives before they could be triggered. It was a victory of silicon over TNT. By 1800 hours, the first emergency generators were humming in the basements of surgical wards, providing the first fast win of the evening, the ability to save lives in a city that was supposed to be a tomb. The geography of the Dnipro River now dictated a new, more stagnant form of warfare. The Antonivsky Bridge, once a pride of Soviet engineering, sat in the water like a broken spine. Its central spans dropped into the silt by a final Russian demolition charge. This physical gap created a strategic paradox. The Russians could not easily return to retake the city without a massive amphibious assault, but the Ukrainians could not easily cross to liberate the rest of the oblast without becoming targets for the Russian Air Force. The river became a liquid front line, a 1,000-meter dead zone monitored by thousands of sensors. On the Ukrainian side, the deployment of the Shark unmanned aerial vehicle changed the calculus. These small catapult-launched drones carry a high-definition electro-optical sensor with 30 times optical zoom, allowing operators to spot a Russian mortar tube from 5 kilometers away. Every time a Russian unit moved on the eastern bank, the Shark would relay the coordinates to a HIMARS battery parked 20 kilometers to the north. The result was a constant, invisible shield of steel that kept the Russian heavy weapons far enough back to prevent a systematic shelling of the civilian population. The emotional climax of the day arrived with the return of the Ukrainian police and the formal raising of the national flag over the regional administration building. This was not just a symbolic act, it was a technical reassertion of sovereignty. As night fell over Kherson, the city was illuminated not by streetlights, but by the thousands of flashlights and candles held by a population that refused to go back indoors. The threat of stay-behind Russian units, specialized saboteurs left to target high-ranking officials, remained high. The Ukrainian SBU, the National Security Service, utilized cellular data forensic tools to identify phones that had recently connected to Russian military towers. Within 12 hours, they had conducted over 50 targeted raids, neutralizing cells of collaborators and hidden soldiers before they could execute their orders. This was the silent, digital cleanup that followed the loud, kinetic victory. The technical superiority of the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus, backed by Western signals intelligence, meant that the Russians were being hunted in the dark by an enemy that knew their names, their ranks, and their exact locations. The city was finally breathing, the air no longer thick with the smell of burning diesel and fear, but with the crisp autumn wind blowing off the river that had once been their prison and was now their shield. The final payoff of the Kherson campaign was not found in the city itself, but in what the retreat meant for the entire southern front. By abandoning the western bank, the Russian military had conceded the high ground and lost their only bridgehead toward the strategic port of Odessa. They had traded 20,000 elite troops' lives for a humiliating retreat to a defensive line they could have held from the beginning. The final reveal of the liberation was the sheer scale of the equipment abandoned. Dozens of T-62 tanks, hundreds of tons of artillery shells, and sophisticated electronic warfare suites that were now being disassembled by Ukrainian and Western scientists to learn the secrets of Russian technology. The liberation of Kherson was the moment the world realized that precision math, motivated civilians, and a few hundred rockets could defeat a superpower's ambition. The watermelon, once a simple fruit, had become the mark of a victory that proved no occupation is permanent when the people choose to bury their flags and wait for the dawn. The city was free, the river was the limit, and the map of the war had been permanently redrawn in blue and yellow. The tactical silence of the evening was shattered at 1900 hours when a hidden Russian ammunition cache, concealed within a subterranean maintenance tunnel near the riverfront, was triggered by a remote thermal detonator. The blast was not a single report, but a secondary chain reaction that ripped through the reinforced concrete foundations of the industrial district. 600 pounds of Soviet-era high explosives ignited a stockpile of 122mm Grad rockets, sending white-hot phosphorus trails spiraling into the night sky like a perverse firework display. The shockwave reached the city center in under 3 seconds, rattling the windows of the administration building and sending a column of black, acrid smoke 500 feet into the atmosphere. This was the scorched earth policy in its purest kinetic form. Russian engineers had calculated the structural weak points of the pier to ensure that the explosion didn't just destroy the building, but collapse the entire loading dock into the Dnipro, denying the Ukrainian Navy a deep water berth. It was a final, violent middle finger to the liberation, a reminder that even in retreat, the Russian military intended to leave behind a landscape of splinters and ash.